Here in Lecture 18, we continue thinking about the American experiment, and we will look at just two of the founders, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. We often lump together these men in the Revolutionary era as founders, and rightfully so, but we have to remember that they were often bitter rivals, disagreed with each other on many important matters. And although we see echoes of current debates, it's important that we don't try to map our own political parties onto the founders. Madison, for example, is a hero to many conservatives, or he should be, but he also wanted a very strong federal government, stronger than Jefferson. And Jefferson appeals to certain kinds of Southern conservatism of land and soil, and yet was much more of an optimist when it came to human nature, though relatively speaking, he still had Lockean sensibilities. All of the founders agreed on the basic pillars of the American experiment. And this is certainly not original to me. Many people have put it this way. But there are essentially three legs to the stool of the American experience. Lockean liberalism, classical republicanism, and Protestant Christianity. So these three strands are often woven together in explanations for the American founding. And depending on your view, if you're more of a secular person, you might be dismayed that Christianity was one of those. If you're an evangelical Christian, you might think, well, boy, was this really a capitulation to be woven together with these two other things? My own personal view is that I think there is a legitimate way that these three things can go together without Christianity being undermined, but that's not the purpose of this particular lecture, but more historical, to point out that these three strands, so a Lockean liberalism, a view of government and limited rights, a classical republicanism and representation in the way in which society and the polis is structured, and it doesn't hold together or make sense without many assumptions of Protestant Christianity. And even though there were serious disagreements among the founders, just those three strands were a lot to agree on. Explains why people as diverse as Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and John Witherspoon could be counted as founding fathers, even though they had massive differences. Broadly speaking, and this is going to get into the heart of Madison and Hamilton and really the American experiment. There are two ways you might approach the creation of a new government. And these two ways have everything to do with your moral philosophy and your anthropology. These two ways can be framed by two very different questions. What is the question you are trying to answer in the way you conceive of the role of government and politics and the state? One question would be like this: what is the best we can accomplish together, and how should we pursue it? What is the best we can accomplish together, and how should we pursue it? That will set you on one sort of trajectory, one kind of government. If you're asking the question, we could all come together, what's the very best thing we could do? And how do we get there? But there's a second question. And it goes like this: what is the worst that could happen, and how do we avoid it? Now, undoubtedly, it's that second sort of question that was in the mind of the founders, especially somebody like Madison. Now, they had certain Enlightenment ideas of progress and optimism, so it wasn't that humans couldn't come together and do anything, and almost everyone in the Enlightenment era has some sense that some things are getting better and we have new discoveries in moral and natural philosophy that are helpful. But that second sort of question is operative. Not thinking so much, How can we come together for some great purpose of human uplift and beauty in the world, but rather, what's the worst that can happen and how do we prevent it? We find this especially in Madison, which is why the American Enlightenment is about liberty. The American experiment wasn't so much about, let's create something amazing and beautiful, as it was about protecting something precious and threatened. Government's primary purpose, they thought, was to secure pre-existing rights. Government doesn't dispense rights, God dispenses rights. Government protects those rights. The role of the government is not to make you happy, it's not to give you property, it's to provide conditions for your life and your liberty and your pursuit of property, of welfare and happiness. Let's see what Madison had to say about this. James Madison was born into a prominent planter family in Virginia. He served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates in the Continental Congress. He was Secretary of State under Jefferson, even though the two were rivals. He then served 2 terms as the 4th President of the United States, 1809 to 1817. He is also hailed as the father of the Constitution, and with good reason. He helped organize the Constitutional Convention. He was one of the most influential members at the convention. He was the secretary for the convention. He helped promote the Constitution almost as much as anyone, and his Virginia plan served as the basis for the convention's deliberation. So he's right to be called the father of the Constitution. There's a lot we could say about Madison. I want to focus on his view of human nature and how it shaped his moral philosophy, how it shaped the Constitution, and how it shaped the American experiment. Madison certainly believed that man was capable of virtue, of enlightenment, of coming together in productive ways for the common good. And yet, fundamental to his political philosophy is the conviction that people are selfish and that the best, i.e., the most realistic way to counteract the depravity of man is to check ambition with ambition. Now, there were many places he could have drawn this view of human nature from. Hobbes and Mandeville were egoists. That is, they were, to use that term, they were ones who felt like man was inherently and basically selfish and self-centered. But Hobbes and Mandeville were kind of persona non grata. People didn't want to be associated with them. Certainly got some of it from Locke. Certainly some sense of it from Montesquieu and the danger of the concentration of powers. But you can also make a very good case that Madison imbibed a basically Calvinist anthropology from his educational background and his theological mentors. Now, admittedly, not everyone wants to make this case, but many scholars do, and I find it persuasive. One book in particular is just a little book by Garrett Ward Sheldon, professor at UVA, a book published by Johns Hopkins University Press, a legitimate academic monograph, makes a strong case in his book, The Political Philosophy of James Madison, that Augustinian or Calvinist anthropology is woven throughout Madison's view of the world. Here's what Sheldon says in the book, quote, "This book reveals that Madison's shifts in emphasis between Lockean liberalism and classical republicanism, or centralized federalism and decentralized states' rights, are best understood in reference to the Calvinist culture and worldview that Madison had imbibed from his Scottish tutors and from Dr. John Witherspoon at Princeton. These influences provided a vision of human nature and political society as volatile and imperfect, always in need of balancing and moderation." Let me give you a little bit of Madison's educational background. At 12, he was sent to a boarding school 70 miles from home. His tutor was the Reverend Donald Robinson, a Scottish minister who had been educated at Aberdeen and at Edinburgh. He taught Madison Latin, Greek, French, math, geography, literature, and theology. For over 4 years, he studied under this Presbyterian pastor. Madison later described him as, quote, "a man of extensive learning and a distinguished teacher." He also said, quote, "All that I have been in life I owe largely to that man." So he was influential in his early years. At 16, Madison moved home to continue his education with Reverend Thomas Martin, the new pastor at his parents' church. This was often the case. You would, especially if you were a landed gentry, you would have a tutor, and the tutor was very often a local pastor. Reverend Martin was a Scottish-Irish minister of evangelical Calvinist convictions, and he convinced Madison not to go to the, quote, decadent Anglican college, but to attend his alma mater, that is Reverend Martin's alma mater, the more spiritually vibrant, more orthodox College of New Jersey. At 18 years old, Madison traveled with Martin 300 miles north from Virginia. It would have been much easier to stay in your own state, but he went up to Princeton. Not surprisingly, a bit older, Madison tested out of the first 2 years of college, completed the rest of his studies in 2 years, and then spent another 6 months of graduate studies. Now, they weren't officially a graduate degree, but 6 months of independent study with Witherspoon in Hebrew and theology. So Madison is at Princeton from 1769 to 1772. You may recall that Witherspoon gets to Princeton in 1768. As Madison studied at Princeton, we can certainly conclude, it's hard to know what of Witherspoon's teaching he came to embrace as his own, but we do know that there was a fondness between the two. Madison later referred to his teacher affectionately as, quote, the old doctor. He defended Witherspoon later against critics. He visited Witherspoon when traveling through New Jersey. Witherspoon later noted, quote, that during the whole time Madison was under my tuition, I never knew him to do or say an improper thing. And with Witherspoon still at the helm as Princeton's president in 1787, they awarded Madison an honorary degree. So certainly there was a good relationship between the two for all those years. As a young man after college, and during the years in the early 70s, there was a revival at Princeton. We don't know what effect it had on Madison, but shortly after college, Madison encouraged a friend in a letter that prominent men would do well, quote, to become fervent advocates in the cause of Christ. As an old man, Madison called the Christian faith, quote, the best and purest religion, which is so essential to moral order of the world and to the happiness of man that arguments which enforce it cannot be drawn from too many sources. So there's an episode as a young man, episode at the end of his life. But to be fair, during the intervening years, we hardly hear anything about his personal beliefs. So I'm not arguing that Madison was a born-again Christian and you have to be wise about the sort of public statements versus private statements. I don't know. We do know that Madison was staunchly opposed to state religion. He didn't even like the word toleration in official documents because he thought toleration, and rightly so, implied that there was a state church and there were dissenting churches to be tolerated. So he didn't want mere toleration. He was opposed to all church establishments, not only for reasons of religious liberty, but he also argued that it was bad for Christianity. He said the ministers in state churches grow lazy, they lose their edge, they coast. Better to have a kind of free market of religious entrepreneurs. He thought making Anglicanism the state church in Virginia had been bad for Anglicanism. In the end, you could look at Madison's religion and say, he says only good things about Christianity. Or you could say, he really hardly says anything about Christianity, let alone a personal relationship with Jesus, to use our lingo. So I'm not arguing he was an evangelical Christian, but I think we can make a good case that he was influenced through his Scottish tutors and through his time at Princeton and through his relationship with Witherspoon by an Augustinian or Calvinist view of the human person. So I want to look at Madison and then This will probably bleed over into Hamilton. At their most famous work, and here's a very good paperback copy of the Federalist Papers. If you never read the Federalist Papers, you somehow made it through all your schooling in America without reading the Federalist Papers, then, well, shame on somebody, because this is part of understanding American history. In September 1787, the governing body of the United States, the Congress of the Confederation, submitted to the 13 colonies the newly adopted Constitution for ratification. Two parties developed: the anti-Federalists, who opposed ratification. They didn't want, they were opposed to a strong federal government that was implied in this Constitution, bringing together these states in one strong union. And then the Federalists, who were in support of ratification. In the state of New York, which could be a hotbed for anti-Federalist sentiment, the local papers were filled with anti-Federalist sympathy. So Alexander Hamilton, from New York, recruited James Madison and John Jay to write a series of articles with him in defense of the Constitution and to publish them in the papers in New York. They wrote under the pseudonym Publius. Not the wonderful grocery store Publix, but Publius, as in Publius Valerius, one of the founders of the Roman Republic. Over the course of 6 months, they wrote 85 articles, which are now published together and called the Federalist Papers. Researchers have done a lot of digging and literary analysis to come up with a convincing delineation of who wrote what. 51 were written by Hamilton, 29 by Madison, and 5 by John Jay. So it really is mainly Hamilton and Madison. The papers are one of the classics of political philosophy and one of the most important pieces of American writing in general. Just to look at a few of the most important of these articles from Madison. Federalist 51, Madison writes about the mixed nature of man. Quote, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence." So there's enough virtue, or at least potential for virtue in man for self-government. See, if you go a Hobbesian view all the way, then you have to have the state, the government as Leviathan. There's no room for self-government. So all of the founders, Madison included, believe in some potential for virtue, that men can govern themselves, but that must be offset with a realistic understanding of their depravity. Only with the right checks and balances can the mixed human person really govern. The best way to foster self-government is not to harness the natural ability of people to work harmoniously toward a common goal, but to frustrate the natural ability of people to consolidate power and oppress others. You see how that gets back to the two macro questions you can ask? Are we thinking, how do we get people to all work together into sunny uplit lands and to do something great for the world? That was not Madison's aim. He was thinking, how can we frustrate the inherent depravity in man that is going to seek power and oppression over others? Which is why you have embedded in the Constitution, you have federal and state authorities, you have separation of powers, as every American child learns, I hope, still. 3 branches of government, co-equal, executive, legislative, judicial. So you have not just one person or one branch, but a separation of powers. You have a bicameral legislature. This was an important and long-standing debate. You know, people talk about equality. Well, they argued at the Constitutional Convention, well, what does equality mean? Okay, we want equality. Is it equality of the states or equality of the persons? If equality means all the states are equal, well, then each state should have the same number of representatives in the legislature. And it doesn't matter if Rhode Island and Delaware are tiny and New York and Virginia are big, equality among the states. But if equality means equality among the persons, then Rhode Island, with a small population, if they have the same number of delegates and representatives, then their people's votes actually count a lot more than those in Virginia and New York. So there isn't equality. So the solution is a bicameral legislature, a Senate which achieves equality among the states because it is United States of America, and a House of Representatives where you have equality among the people, which is based proportionally upon a state's population. All of these were ways to have checks and balances. Let me read several paragraphs from probably the two most famous of Madison's Federalist papers. The first is Federalist number 10. And forgive me, it's hard to be read to, especially over camera. But if you had it in front of you, Federalist 10. He says, the latent causes, he's writing about factions, of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of society. A zeal for different opinion concerning religion, concerning government, many other points, as well as speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders, ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties. He goes on, so strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle unfriendly passions and excite the most violent conflicts. He's right, isn't he? He says, you just look at people. It's human nature. They have strong religious opinions. They attach themselves to different leaders. And he knew this even before Twitter. I mean, he's describing social media. The most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle and excite violent conflicts. He says this is what people are like. So what do we do with these factions? Well, he goes on, he says, well, maybe if we have an enlightened statesman to rule over them. He says, quote, it is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. No, he says, well, you can't count on that. Even if you could find one now, how do you know you will always have one? So he says, either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority having such coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. So here's his famous argument. He says, we don't need fewer factions, we need more factions. Sounds contradictory, but here's his reasoning. We're bound to factions, we're bound to disagreement, and the majority is bound in time, even in self-government, to want to oppress the minority, to want to find ways to make and trample over the rights of others. So how do we do it? He says, well, we could try to get the majority to never make that decision. He says that won't work. What we need is to have so many parties and factions that no one can really fully get the leg up on somebody else. Now, I know the tremendous, egregious blind spot in all of this is race and slavery, and that just simply must be acknowledged, not without some important debates at the Constitutional Convention, but certainly it is a blind spot in the American founding. He says later, he's writing about republics, because one of the chief arguments against the Constitution was we can't have a republic. Republics were always small. The only way to have a republic is to be very tiny. But his argument in Hamilton is actually a big republic, like this whole continent, is going to be better, because the bigger you are, the more people you have, the more factions you have, and the more factions you have, the less likely it is for one of them to have authority and oppression over all the others. He is not one to put a lot of confidence in pure democracy. And we hear that all the time. If only just put it to a vote to the people. Look, you're barking up the wrong founder's tree if you think that's Madison's game. He says, hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So he advocates a republic. He says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. This is the advantage we have, our representatives. We have a big country with lots of parties, and there are greater obstacles to oppression. So that's why the Constitution, whether you like it or not now, has an electoral college. Not only to balance the power and influence of the states, and we don't really do it this way anymore, but because Madison didn't trust that the people themselves, he thought there were all sorts of dangers of mob rule and demagoguery and a strong leader who says what people want to say. He did not trust that the crowds and the mobs were going to make the right decision. So he wanted a layer, and he thought the Electoral College was a layer between just electing the demagogue who stirs up your animal passions. And this representative, this Republican form of government was better, Madison thought, than pure democracy because of the inherent ambition and selfishness of the human person. Come back in just a minute and look at the second of his most famous Federalist papers, Federalist 51. We'll finish up with some thoughts on Madison and the Constitution, and then end with Hamilton. We continue with Madison and looking at two of the most famous Federalist papers, number 10 and now 51. It is one of the most well-known paragraphs in all of the Federalist papers, and it gets to the heart of Madison's view of human ambition and how to counteract it. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers, so there's some Montesquieu influence, in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must be in this, as in all other cases, made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government? Itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If men were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. The policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. As a paragraph that repays careful study. Madison says, if we had the nature of angels, we don't need these precautions. If we're governed by angels, we just trust, go ahead, all of our elected officials are angels, go do whatever you want. But he says, of course, that's not the case. So how do we guard against government encroaching upon our liberties and the majority oppressing minorities, or vice versa? He says we must have auxiliary precautions. Ambition must counteract ambition. So the biggest safeguard for liberty is that government is derived from the people and responsible to the people, but he says the government is still run by people, and it's still a reflection of human nature. And so we are by design, Madison says, going to have ambition countering ambition, and we are going to put power in several different spheres so that no one can accumulate the concentration of it. So whenever I hear Washington, D.C. is in gridlock, I imagine Madison saying somewhere, that's the way I designed it. When people say, why can't Washington get anything done? I think the founders would say, Madison, Hamilton would say, we designed the Constitution so that it is very difficult to get things done. Because their design was not how to get government to do a lot of great things. Their design was how do we keep government from doing a lot of bad things? So we want to make it difficult. If you want to make it very easy, then you have a king, you have a dictator. And we see this in times of once-in-a-century pandemic. You have to, you have to give certain powers to have shutdowns, and you allow officials to do things you wouldn't normally do. And then Madison would say, there may be reason to do that in certain times of crisis, but the danger is whether those things then become the norm and whether you've now ceded in normal times of peace to the government the role that it ought not to have. That's Madison's argument. Things are not supposed to be easily done by the state. They're supposed to be frustrated. Madison was realistic about human nature. Realistic that government is about possibilities, not impossibilities, that there are trade-offs, that you cannot get all of good things and no bad things. The system that they created was not everything here is good and we get nothing bad. There's always trade-offs. So he says in Federalist 41, the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect good. And that in every political institution, a power to advance public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. Madison dealt with people not as he wished them to be, but as they were. He devised a constitution that sought to counteract the inherent vices in man and the corrupting influences of power. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, were implemented in the intervening months to ease the passage in some states. The Constitution became the official governing document for the United States when the required 9 of 13 states ratified it, that being New Hampshire, on June 21st, 1788. It wasn't ratified by all the states until Rhode Island approved the document on May 29, 1790. Certainly not perfect. It was written by men, not by angels, not by God. It was a compromise document, as all documents like that must be, especially when it came to slavery. No doubt Southern interests had to be mollified or the Constitution would not have passed. Most infamously with the 3/5 compromise, the slave population was to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Of course, remember that it was, ironically, the southern states that wanted their slaves to be counted as full persons, not because they were willing to give them that dignity, but because they wanted it for purposes of representation. And it was the North that said, no, they ought not to be counted. They're your slaves, and we're not going to give you more power in the South. And so the compromise was the 3/5 compromise, certainly an egregious element in the Constitution, later superseded by the 14th Amendment. But importantly, and this point is argued, I think, convincingly in a new book, Madison's insistence at the convention led them to refuse any language that allowed for there to be, quote, property in man. Now, I don't want to make Madison out to be some quasi-abolitionist. His estates had slaves, but he held his ground, and so did others, that they would not refer to slaves as property, but as persons. And that became a rallying cry for abolitionists in the 19th century. And so the new book called No Property in Man, which came out a couple of years ago, is arguing for this. Certainly a mixed bag, a paradox, but trying to push back against some arguments in the last 30 years that suggest that the Constitution was just a document of white supremacy and white oppression. The Constitution of the United States is the oldest in the world and the shortest. Only 4,400 words. It's in original form. 7,500 words, including all the amendments. And remarkable to think, in 232 years since its final ratification, it's only been amended 17 times. The last testament from James Madison, published at his wishes upon his death, was called Advice to My Country in the last years of his life. It was only 2 paragraphs, and here's the last one. The advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as a Pandora with her box opened, and the disguised one as the serpent creeping his deadly wiles into paradise. It is a fitting last testament to describe James Madison because it, in a way, doesn't it pull together those 3 strands? As he is so intent upon the preservation of the union of this new country based on liberty and limited government, Lockean liberalism. And he also pulls in there an allusion to Pandora, so not Roman, but Greek there, but to classical sources. And then the second allusion is, of course, to Genesis and the Garden of Eden and influence there of Christian sources. Perhaps in a notable way, even in his last testament, weaving together these 3 strands of not only his thought, but 3 strands that come together in the American founding. Transition here for our remaining minutes to look more briefly at Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was younger than Madison, but of course, as all of us know, died much younger than Madison, and tragically so, 1757 to 1804. It wasn't too many years ago that the government was thinking of removing Alexander Hamilton from the $10 bill, and then the Hamilton musical hit, and that's likely not to happen. So we live in an age where people know more about Hamilton than they have in many years, or at least as much as you know through the musical. He was a man of enormous ambition and energy. His genius was in preparation, hard work, and organization. He was born an illegitimate child, living in the British colony of Nevis in the Leeward Islands. His mother died. His father abandoned him. In 1772, so 14 or 15 years old, Hugh Knox, a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian and Princeton graduate, together with Nicholas Kruger, got him from Nevis to New York City. Again, we've seen Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, all at some point in their life had a Scottish minister, influence, educator, tutor. He made a name for himself as a pamphleteer in support of the Patriot cause. During the Revolutionary War, he then became one of the most trusted officers on Washington's staff, working his way up from an aide-de-camp all the way to, forget if it was lieutenant colonel, but an officer in Washington's regiment. Hamilton wanted a strong central government and a strong chief executive. Some of his contemporaries thought him too conservative, too sympathetic to monarchy, but Hamilton was not a romantic when it came to what human beings could accomplish together. He had little patience for Jefferson's relative confidence in human affections, more of a Hutchisonian moral sense theory. and Jefferson's greater confidence in the ordinary man. Hamilton had a dim view of human nature. He was especially pessimistic about pure democracy. He thought most people were too ignorant, too selfish, and too driven by their passions to rule wisely. And you think about it, certainly their upbringing has something to do with this. Hamilton did not grow up in a noble family. He was not surrounded by enlightened elites. He was not surrounded by gentlemen farmers. And he did not claim to be one. He did not aspire to become one. He did not trust them to rule better than anyone else. The last years of his life were difficult. His eldest son died in a duel. Just stop dueling. In 1801, one of his daughters suffered from madness. He did, however, begin to take religion more seriously. As one author puts it, quote, "For the first time in his life, Hamilton began to find solace in Christianity. He began to worry about his immortal soul more than his mortal reputation." Tragically, famously, he died in July 1804 due to complications from a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. At least our vice presidents aren't dueling. Hamilton never ran for office. He was appointed to every important position he held. What were his views, quickly? As I said, he wanted a strong federal government, strong financial controls, a strong bank, strong chief executive. He could have monarchical tendencies, but he explains in Federalist 69 at length that the President of the United States was not like the King of Great Britain. I won't read the long paragraph to you, but it goes on to explain their differences. The president would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years. The King of Great Britain is perpetual and hereditary prince. The one would be amenable to personal punishment and disgrace. The other person is sacred and inviolable. The one would have a qualified negative upon the acts of the legislative body, the other an absolute negative. The one would have a right to command the military and naval forces. The other, in addition to this right, possesses that of declaring war, of raising and regulating armies. So he goes on to say there really is a difference between the president and the king. He, like Madison, wanted a republic, but he also understood that a republic was no easy fix for human vice. He says in Federalist number 6, "Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not the former administered by men as well as the latter?" So he says, yeah, republics are better, but they still have men to lead them. And you look in history, it's not like republics don't go to war. He says, "Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with promises of an exemption from the imperfections, the weaknesses, and the evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue?" So there are certain types of political philosophy which will become more prevalent in the 19th and 20th centuries, which try to explicitly or implicitly make a kind of heaven on earth. And even in the early part of the 19th century, there were early socialist utopian schemes, which people like Madison had no patience for. Hamilton didn't live that long. But Hamilton is saying, there's no golden age. We are far from a happy empire of perfect wisdom and virtue. Okay, we have to deal with imperfections, weaknesses, and evils. Every society is going to have them. They were realists. This also made him realistic about what government could accomplish and whether it could guard against all eventualities. He says in Federalist 16, "No form of government can always either avoid or control revolutions and dismemberments, upheavals. It is in vain to hope to guard against events too mighty for human foresight or precaution, and it would be idle to object to a government because it could not perform impossibilities." Hamilton would say, certainly to people on both sides of the aisle today in America, you are wanting the government to perform impossibilities. but it can't. We have to be realistic. He was optimistic that the science of politics had seen great improvements, but he thought this had been accomplished through the regular distribution of power into distinct departments, through the introduction of checks and balances, the institution of judges, the representation of the people in the legislature. In other words, basically what he was arguing for to offset the natural inclinations of men. Federalist 15, Hamilton asks, why had government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. In the last lectures, we'll talk more about the French Revolution, in particular Edmund Burke's response to it, but Hamilton had a response to the French Revolution. He wrote, Views on the French Revolution in 1794. Hamilton lamented. Remember, Jefferson was much more optimistic about the revolution, at least at first. Hamilton lamented that religion was being overthrown for a godless reason. He was also concerned that radicals were championing a form of government that could not work with human nature. Listen, this is very telling what Hamilton says. 1794, views on the French Revolution. Just one paragraph. Fanatics in political science have since exaggerated and perverted their doctrines. Theories of government unsuited to the nature of man, miscalculating the force of his passions, disregarding the lessons of experimental wisdom, have been projected and recommended. A league has at length been cemented between the apostles and disciples of irreligion and of anarchy. Religion and government have both been stigmatized as abuses, as unwarrantable restraints upon the freedom of man, as causes of the corruption of his nature, intrinsically good, as sources of an artificial and false morality, which tyrannically robs him of the enjoyments for which his passions fit him, and as clogs upon his progress to the perfection for which he was destined. You see what Hamilton is saying? He's arguing strenuously against the French Revolution. The French Revolution is saying that religion and government are the problems. They are corrupting man. If we would just let people be free, they are on their way to perfection. And Hamilton scoffs and says, you are devising governments not fit for human nature. The proper role of government for Madison and Hamilton, and more broadly for the founders, though as we've seen Jefferson and others have different degrees. The proper role was to safeguard life and liberty. The chief end of government is preserving liberty because the natural state of man is one that threatens liberty. And just incidentally, liberty is not the same as license. There was a letter published in a Boston paper in 1763 which gave the view of many. It said, political liberty does not consist in unrestrained freedom. In governments, that is in societies directed by laws, liberty can consist only in the power of doing what we ought to will and in not being constrained to do what we ought not to will. You don't hear liberty as the same as license. Barry Allen Shane, in his book, The Myth of American Individualism, The Protestant Origins of American Political Thought, was right. Quote, Americans in the 18th century had demonstrated little interest in the most optimistic tenets of the Enlightenment. They had rejected those who had labeled as absurd the doctrine of original sin, as well as those who argued for infinite human progress. Certainly we see this dim view of human nature in Hamilton and Madison. We will, in the last two lectures in this course, even though we're looking at individual thinkers in the Enlightenment, expand a bit out to see how these different views set us on a trajectory for different political and moral views today. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but perhaps in closing here, it might do well to just summarize this American experiment, as I've been calling it, and understand it by seeing what it is not. That is, to compare it with what was happening in France, and in particular what was espoused by Rousseau. Just think of some of the differences. Is human nature fixed, or is it malleable? Rousseau said it's malleable. It can be changed. American founders Madison, Hamilton said it's fixed. You have to deal with people the way they are. Christianity, for the French Revolution, was seen as corrupting true religion. They weren't all atheists. Some were deists. They wanted to strip down but Christianity, supernatural, it corrupted true religious impulse. That's what Rousseau thought. For the founders, even though most were not evangelical Christians, they still saw Christianity was necessary for genuine virtue. Are people selfish so that we must find ways to avoid them oppressing each other? Or are people basically good and we must find ways to avoid spoiling them? That will set your government on a very different trajectory. People are selfish, so we have to find ways so that they don't oppress each other, or people are basically good, and society is what corrupts them. Society is what allows self-interested people to get along, or society is what corrupts the noble savage. Does the individual come first, or does the collective come first? Do our rights come from God, which then the state is obligated to protect, a la Lockean liberalism and the American founding, or must rights be subordinated to the general will, as in Rousseau's social contract theory? Is property the source of all evil, as Rousseau said, or is the pursuit of property, meaning happiness, welfare, well-being, an inalienable right? On one hand, in one conception, government has massive power in the interest of the common good. And in the other, government has very limited power, and it is enumerated. The basic formula for the American founders, their moral philosophy goes like this. There is a God. He gives us duties. He gives us rights. Government exists to protect those rights. People can be virtuous. We need them to be virtuous, but we deal with them as people who cannot be trusted with power. So the best government represents the people, but also frustrates their interests.